Okay, this is chapter 21, section 2, part 2, continuing from our previous lesson. So Louis XIV weakens the nobility's authority, and at the end, the nobles' rebellion failed. So if you remembered in our previous lesson, there was a, a lot of riots going on that the nobles were controlling. And even when the violence was over, Louis XIV never forgot this. So, in the end, the nobles' rebellion failed for three reasons. Its leaders distrusted one another even more than the distrusted Mazarin, and he was that cardinal who took over after Rachiel, the other cardinal. Um, and he was going to take power, in a sense, for a while until Louis XIV came of age because he took over when he was 4 years old. So, in addition, the government used violent repression, and finally, the peasants and townspeople grew wary of the disorder and the fighting. So, for many years afterward, the people of France accepted the oppressive laws of an absolute king. They didn't like the idea. They were convinced the alternative, rebellion, was even worse. So, France was starting to accept that, hey, even though we have a oppressive king that we don't really like, we don't really have much of a choice because this rebellion stuff is crazy. We can't do that. So when Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, the 22-year-old Louis took control of the government himself. He weakened the power of the nobles by excluding them from his councils. So he didn't even involve them in any type of government. In contrast, he increased the powers of the government agents called intendants, who collected taxes and administered justice. To keep power under control, he made sure that the local officials communicated regularly with him. So he's got his close eye on everything. Economic growth. Louis devoted himself to helping France attain economic, political, and cultural brilliance. No one assisted him more in achieving these goals than his Minister of France. Minister of Finance, sorry. No one assisted him more achieving these goals than Minister of Finance Jean Baptiste Colbert. And Colbert believed in the theory of mercantilism. To prevent wealth from leaving a country, Colbert tried to make France self sufficient. He wanted to be able to manufacture everything it needed instead of relying on imports. Maybe we should do this as a country. To expand manufacturing, Colbert gave government funds and tax benefits to French companies. To protect France's industry, he placed a high tariff on goods from other countries. A tariff is a tax on goods coming from a different country. So if I'm going to buy something from China, I have to pay a tariff. So if I'm buying something from China, it's $4 from China. It's like, oh, sweet, cool, I'm getting it for $4. Nope, you're wrong. You're going to have to pay a tariff when it comes into this country, so you're probably paying $8. You're probably paying double whatever it's worth. Colbert also recognized the importance of colonies, which provided raw materials and a market for manufactured goods. So, if you remember in our previous lessons, we kind of talked about mercantilism, and that's the belief that you want to be a self sustaining country. You want to make everything on your own. You want to sell your products for more money than you're paying for them. It's this idea of just controlling everything within your own government and not relying on any other country. The French government encouraged people to migrate to France's new colony in Canada. And there, the fur trade added to the French trade and wealth. So that's a good thing for the French. After Colbert's death, Louis announced a policy that slowed France's economic progress. In 1685, he canceled the Edict of Nantes, which protected the religious freedom of the Huguenots. In response, thousands of Huguenots, artisans, and business people fled the country. They were like, dude, if you're not going to abide by this edict that we came up with, um, like 20 years ago, we're out. So that's going to hurt That's going to hurt France's economy at the time, and Louis's policy thus robbed France of many skilled workers. So those guys are going to dip out and say, yo, screw this, we're out of here. We're not going to hang around. All right, the Sun King's grand style. In his personal finances, Louis spent a fortune to surround himself with luxury. For example, each meal was a feast. So this guy was balling it up. He was a baller, if you will. An observer claimed that the king once devoured 4 plates of soup, a whole pheasant, a partridge of garlic sauce, 2 slices of ham, a salad, a plate of pastries, food, hard-boiled eggs, in a single sitting. This dude was eating mad stuff. He's eating a smorgasbord here, meaning a buffet. Nearly 500 cooks, waiters, and other servants worked to satisfy his taste. Told you, man, this guy's a baller. Every morning, the chief, Valent, woke up Louis at 8:30. And outside the curtains of Louis's canopy stood at least 100 of the most privileged nobles at court. They were waiting to help dress the king. Only four would be allowed to honor the handling of his slippers or holding his sleeves for him. Oh, this guy seems to be pretty exquisite. Meanwhile, outside his bedchamber, lesser nobles waited in his palace halls and hoped that Louis would even notice him. A kingly nod or a glance of approval or a kind word, these marks of royal attention determined whether a noble succeeded or failed. So getting this dude's approval was pretty important. Louis XIV was only 5 foot 4 inches tall, so he was 5'4". But when he was wearing his high heels and a wig, and he had about 1,000 of them, he would appear almost 7 feet tall. So, I mean, this guy was pretty short, but with all those accessories, it made him definitely look a lot taller than what he really was. Having the nobles at his palace increased royal authority in 2 ways. It made the nobility totally dependent on Louis. So it made these rich guys depending on him. And remember, he wanted to control the nobility. It also took them away from their homes, thereby giving more power to the intendants, who Louis XIV wanted to give the power to. Louis required hundreds of nobles to live with him in his splendid palace. And as you can see here to the left, he's got a quite splendid palace, which is still up today. You can still visit this place today. Let's see, required him the splendid palace. He built in Versailles, Palace of Versailles. This is about 11 miles southwest of Paris. Everything about the Palace of Versailles, it was immense. It faced a huge royal courtyard dominated by a statue of Louis XIV. The palace itself stretched for a distance of 500 yards, and because of its great size, Versailles was like a small royal city. And this is where Louis XIV was living. Its rich doctrine and furnishings clearly showed Louis's wealth and power to everyone that came. So when you went to the Palace of Versailles, you go there, I mean, you could see all these people coming in by carriage, by horseback, and you're going to come into my house, check it out. I'm balling it up. I got this garden over here. I got these fancy fountains. I mean, everything about this place was exquisite. Versailles was the center of arts during Louis's reign. So this is where everything's going to go down. It made opera and the ballet more popular. He even danced to the title. He even had a song named after him called The Sun King. And not since Augustus of Rome had there been a European monarch who supported the arts as much as Louis XIV. So in his Palace of Versailles, he was all about this, all about the arts, all about the singing and statues and paintings. Under Louis XIV, the chief purpose of art was no longer to glorify God like it had been done in the Middle Ages, nor was it the purpose to glorify human potential, like it had been done in the Renaissance. Now the purpose of art was to glorify the king and to promote values that supported Louis's absolute rule. So this guy was all about himself. I mean, take a look at this place. It's pretty sweet. All right, the Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles was 14 miles inside of Paris. Outside, sorry. The Palace of Versailles was 14 miles outside of Paris. So Paris is a big city. So 14 miles away from this was where he put his palace. It's 5,000 acres of forest and gardens and lawn. That's a lot. My first house had an acre, and I had to cut the grass every week. It took me 3 hours to do it. So I don't know what 5,000 acres would be like. So it had 1,400 fountains, so many that they could not even run them all at the same time. The workers would just turn them on when Louis walked by and then turn them off when he walked away. So this guy had fountain workers just to turn it on when he walked by. The cost to build the palace was approximately $2.5 billion. That's a lot of money back then. $2.5 billion. It took 36,000 people to build the Palace of Versailles. People who wanted to speak to the king could not just knock on his door. Instead, they had to use their left pinky finger to gently scratch the door until they were granted permission to enter. And as a result of this, many of the courtiers, if you will, the people who lived in, if they were lucky enough to live in this court, they grew their fingernail longer than others. So maybe that's how you could tell if someone was living at the Palace of Versailles. So if you see here, you got Paris, 14 miles. I guess southwest of that would be the Palace of Versailles. All right, under Louis the 14th, France was the most powerful country in Europe. Yeah, true. In 1660, France had about 20 million people. It was four times as many as England and 10 times as the Dutch Republic, which was above it. And the French army was far ahead of other states' armies in size and training and weaponry. So it was well ahead of its rivals or anyone in that surrounding area. All right, in 1667, 6 years after Mazarin's death, Louis invaded the Spanish Netherlands. Through his campaign, he gained 12 towns. Encouraged by his success, he personally led an army into the Dutch Netherlands in 1672. The Dutch saved their country by opening dikes and flooding their countryside. So that's how the Dutch were able to save their country, by flooding it. It was the same tactic they used in the revolt against Spain 100 years earlier. The war ended in 1678 with the Treaty of Nigemen. I can't speak French. Sorry. French gained several towns and a region called French Comté. So, it looks like they gained some land from this war. When it was all said and done, Louis decided to fight additional wars, but his luck ran out. By the end of the 1680s, a European-wide alliance had formed to stop France because they were getting too big. By banding together, the weaker countries could match France's strength. His defense strategy was meant to achieve balance and power, in which no single country or group of countries could dominate the other. And in 1689, the Dutch Prince William of Orange became King of England. He joined the League of Augsburgs, which consisted of the Austrian Habsburg Empire, the kings of Sweden and Spain, and the leaders of several other small European states. So together, these countries equaled France's strength. All these surrounding countries that France was dominating, they all had to come together and say, "Yo, we gotta come together. France is going to take over everything. We're all going to be speaking French, and we don't want to speak French. We want to speak English and German." French at this time had been weakened by a series of poor harvests. That means they weren't growing enough food. That added to the consistent warfare brought great suffering to the French people. So they had a bunch of wars going on. People were dying from that. Now the people are starving because they're not getting food. And he was also adding taxes to these people, which Louis imposed on to finance his war. So he was taxing the people. The people weren't eating because their harvest was poor, and a bunch of people were dying. And all of his wars that he was creating to gain more land and more power. Tired of hardship, the French people longed for peace. And what they got was another war. And in 1700, the childless king of Spain, Charles II, died after promising his throne to Louis XIV's 16-year-old grandson, Philip. And the two greatest powers in Europe, enemies for so long, were now both ruled by the French Bourbons. Not good at all. Other countries felt threatened by this increase of the Bourbons' dynasty of power. So yeah, in 1701, England, Austria, and the Dutch Republic, Portugal, and several other German and Italian states joined together to prevent a union of the French and Spanish thrones. That would have been disastrous. The long struggle that followed was known as the War of Spanish Succession. And the costly war dragged on until 1714, so that's 13 years. And the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in that year. Under its terms, Louis XIV's grandson was allowed to remain king of Spain so long as the thrones of France and Spain were not united. Interesting. So all that fighting for just that. The big winner of the war was Great Britain. From Spain, Britain took a fortress that controlled the entrance of the Mediterranean Sea. Spain also granted a British company permission to send enslaved Africans to Spain's American colonies. It increased Spanish involvement in trading enslaved Africans. In addition, France gave Britain North American territories, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and abandoned its claims in the Hudson Bay region. The Austrian Habsburgs took the Spanish Netherlands and other Spanish lands in Italy, and Prussia and Savoy were recognized as kingdoms. Savoy. Let's see here. Louis' death and legacy. Louis' last years were most sad and glorious. Realizing that his wars ruined France, he regretted the suffering that he had brought to his people, and he died in 1715. News of his death promoted rejoicing throughout France, so a bunch of people were happy. The people had enough of the Sun King. They were tired of this dude. Louis left a mixed legacy in his country. On a positive side, France was certainly a power to be reckoned with in Europe. France ranked above all other European nations in art, literature, statesmanship during Louis' reign. In addition, France was considered the military leader of Europe. His military might allowed France to develop a strong empire of colonies, which provided resources and goods for trade. On the negative side, consistent warfare and the construction of the Palace of Versailles plunged France into a staggering debt. Also, resentment over the tax burden imposed on the people and Louis' abuse of power would plague his heirs and eventually lead to a revolution. Absolute rule didn't die with Louis XIV. His enemies in Prussia and Austria had been experimenting with their own forms of absolute monarchy. So you're going to see other countries start to do what Louis did, and we'll get into that next lesson. So thanks for listening. Hopefully you learned something. Peace out.